We tend to think of famous authors as larger-than-life figures whose work has transcended their immortal shells. But what if the opposite were true? What if the man behind the myth was just as terrifying as the stories he told? In this video, we'll do our best to answer that question by looking at the disturbing psychology of one of the most beloved writers in history, Edgar Allan Poe. If you ever want to feel truly horrified, look no further than the works of master of macabre Edgar Allan Poe. Now, if you're not familiar with his work, let us catch you up. Born in 1809, Poe published his first book of poetry in 1827, followed by Tales of Ratiocination in 1842. The latter established him as a master of mystery, weaving together plots that centered around the human psyche, often featuring themes of death, murder, and, well, madness. Stories like The Telltale Heart and The Black Cat are still studied today for their psychological insight and gripping narratives. However, it's important to remember that Poe wasn't merely crafting these tales from thin air. They were heavily influenced by his own life experiences, and a deep dive into his biography reveals a chilling reality. As you're about to see, Poe's life was far from normal, and it might have played a significant role in shaping his now infamous work. It's no secret that Poe had a pretty rough childhood. His father abandoned the family when he was just a baby, and his mother, who was an actress, died when he was only 2 years old. He was then taken in by John and Frances Allen, a wealthy childless couple who doted on the young boy. But there was a catch. Despite being related by marriage to Poe's mother, Frances was also Poe's first cousin once removed. So yeah, their relationship was definitely weird. And things got even weirder when Poe reached puberty and began to resemble his late mother both in appearance and behavior. Frances became increasingly uncomfortable with their relationship, and she started treating Poe more like a servant than a member of the family. This treatment continued until Frances passed away in 1829, at which point John Allan finally acknowledged Poe as his literary heir. Unfortunately, their relationship didn't last long because John passed away just 3 years later. Now, despite the fact that he'd been disowned by his adoptive mother and lost his only remaining guardian, Poe was actually pretty happy about John's passing. Why? Because it meant he was finally rich. You see, upon John's death, Poe inherited a substantial amount of money that allowed him to marry his childhood sweetheart, Virginia Clem, and live a comfortable life in relative peace. And yet this period of stability and happiness would prove to be the exception rather than the rule in Poe's tragically turbulent life. You see, just a year after his marriage, Poe's aunt, Maria Clem, moved in with him and his wife. And while she may have initially seemed like a nice addition to the family, she soon revealed herself to be a domineering, manipulative, and deeply unpleasant woman. For example, she was a heavy drinker and would regularly shame Poe for forgetting her anniversary, an oversight that happened quite frequently since Poe suffered from what we would call today memory problems, likely due to undiagnosed bipolar disorder. In fact, Maria was so unpleasant that Poe eventually asked her to move out, but she refused unless he paid her $1,000 in cash. Seeing as he didn't have that kind of money lying around, he relented and kept her around. However, he grew to resent his wife's mother so much that he wrote a poem called The Conqueror Worm, which featured a character eerily similar to her. Poe's story could almost be considered a Shakespearean tragedy, a cautionary tale of how external circumstances can influence one's mental state. The hardships he faced throughout his life, coupled with the loss of his parents at such a young age, left him vulnerable to severe mental health issues. Interestingly, this isn't just speculation. There are numerous accounts from those close to Poe that suggest he was mentally unstable. One of the most detailed and disturbing accounts comes from Poe's foster mother, Frances, who described him as having periods of great gloom that lasted for days or even weeks at a time. During these episodes, he would hardly speak, eat very little, and appear totally lost in thought. Frances also noted that Poe was plagued by morbid thoughts, particularly regarding death and the decay of the human body. These dark musings would later become a staple of his writing, but they were also a source of great distress for him personally. But why? Well, according to biographer Kenneth Silverman, Poe's intense fascination with death likely stemmed from the premature death of his mother, as well as his own awareness of his fragile health. Poe knew that he had a weak heart, and he used this knowledge to explore themes of mortality in his work. But the disturbing side of this fascination was that he was also intrigued by the physical sensations associated with death, such as the feeling of a heart beating its last. Poe's interest in the visceral aspects of death is evident in many of his stories, including The Premature Burial, in which a man is accidentally entombed alive, and The Fall of the House of Usher, in which a dying man is consumed by his own bodily fluids. While these stories are undoubtedly disturbing to modern readers, they offer a glimpse into the dark recesses of Poe's mind and the lengths to which his curiosity would take him. Yet Poe's morbid interest didn't end at death. He was also obsessed with the human heart, both literally and metaphorically. In fact, he was so fascinated by the heart that he performed an autopsy on a recently deceased woman to examine its size and weight. And this macabre hobby bled into his work as well. In stories like The Telltale Heart, Poe explores the heart as a symbol of guilt and paranoia, using the sound of a beating heart to drive his protagonist insane. But beyond his professional writings, Poe's personal letters reveal a man tormented by his own heart, both physically and emotionally. Throughout his life, Poe suffered from heart palpitations and other symptoms of heart disease, which he believed were the result of his mother's substance use. In one letter he wrote, "My disease is a complication of the most deadly kind. It is the inheritance of my mother, who died of it, and of which my own symptoms, as well as those of my dear departed brother Horatio, are the best proofs." However, Poe's heart troubles were not only physical. He was also deeply affected by the emotional toll of his relationships, particularly his fraught relationship with his wife's mother. In a letter to a friend, he wrote, "I have indeed, my dear friend, known all the gradations of that terrible suffering which it is impossible to utter, which no one can even imagine. The utter prostration of soul and sense which no one can be entirely without the least hope of recovery. My heart has been rent asunder by the cruel hand of a woman." Clearly, Poe is a complex individual whose experiences and emotions shaped his unique perspective on the world. While his life may have been filled with darkness and despair, it was through his writing that he was able to explore the depths of human emotion and experience. Another thing that made Poe different was his unhealthy obsession with his wife, Virginia. When Poe married his first cousin, Virginia Clem, she was just 13 years old. While their marriage may have been legal, given that Virginia had reached the age of consent in the state of New York, it's important to acknowledge the power dynamics at play in this relationship. Poe was 26 at the time of their marriage, and he was essentially her guardian, given that she lived with him and his aunt. Additionally, the fact that Virginia was Poe's first cousin adds another layer of complexity to their relationship. Despite these challenges, Poe and Virginia's relationship appears to have been loving and passionate. In fact, Poe's biographer, Arthur Hobson Quinn, suggests that their love for each other was one of the few genuinely happy aspects of Poe's life. However, this love was also unhealthy and obsessive. Throughout Virginia's life, Poe treated her like a precious possession, showering her with gifts and affection. He was so possessive of her, in fact, that he became enraged when she spent time with other men. And as Virginia's health began to decline, Poe became increasingly frantic in his efforts to save her. Ultimately, Virginia passed away from tuberculosis in 1847, and Poe was devastated. He spent the last years of his life mourning her and even wrote a series of poems dedicated to her memory. But the intensity of his grief raised eyebrows among his contemporaries. One critic, Rufus Wilmot Griswold, would later write, "It was one of the most disgusting exhibitions of morbid affection that the world has ever seen." So, yeah, Poe's love for his wife was clearly intense, but it wasn't exactly healthy. And this unhealthy attachment was just one aspect of his personality that contributed to the disturbing nature of his work. Now, if you enjoyed this video, make sure to check out our latest content where we explore the twisted tale of real-life serial killer and cannibal Jeffrey Dahmer. With his horrific crimes and disturbing hobbies, Dahmer's story is one that will stick with you long after you've watched. Just click on the link provided to get started. Thanks for watching.